We're pleased that you have tuned into this sermon. It's part of a larger worship experience here at the church, and our prayer is that as you listen, God has a word for you.
Everyone wants to pass the peace with little Zoe, so there will be opportunity after the service. Continuing along as we are this week in our summer sermon series, Tell Me a Story, we have an opportunity to look at another account from the Hebrew Scriptures, which is very much intended to inspire us when it comes to faithfulness and fidelity. And the story we're going to look at today comes from the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a collection of stories and also prophecies which are set in the Babylonian captivity. So, by way of a brief reminder, the kingdom of Israel split north and south, and in the 9th century BCE, the northern kingdom was taken out by the Assyrians, and it ceased to exist as a city-state. A couple hundred years later, in the 6th century, the southern kingdom, Judah, was taken out by the Babylonians, and Jerusalem was destroyed. And as was the habit and practice of the Babylonians, scores of hostages were taken back to Babylon, and they were held there as exiles, and this was to ensure, it is thought, the good behavior of the people who stayed behind in Israel-Palestine. So they are there in captivity, but they were able to, set up lives for themselves, and some of them even served in fairly high capacities in the royal court, but they were always in exile. They were always captives. And after 70 years, they were finally allowed to return. Now, during the Babylonian captivity, there was immense pressure, as we can understand, placed on these exiles to conform, to lose their Jewish distinctiveness, to adopt the gods and the religious practices of the Babylonians, to dress that way, and to lose their language and their distinctives. There was great pressure on them to assimilate, because after all, they had been conquered by the Babylonians. And there were many who did that. But there were others who stood firm, and they resisted. And particularly when it came to compromising their faith, they simply wouldn't go there. And they, sometimes at significant cost, chose to remain faithful to God. And so when the captives and their descendants returned to Israel, to Judah, some 70 years later, they brought with them stories about a man named Daniel and his friends, who were very courageous and stood firm in the face of this constant pressure to assimilate and to lose their distinctiveness as Jewish men and women. And these stories were told and retold and cherished, and then, about 200 years before Jesus was born, they were formally written down in a book that we have, the book of Daniel. And this is actually, it is thought, the last book that was written for inclusion into the Hebrew Scriptures, at least as to when it was actually written. And the story we're looking at today concerns one of those valiant stands against a direct threat to religious fidelity to the God of Israel. It's the story of the fiery furnace. And the story starts, the challenge begins when the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king of the Babylonian Empire, which stretched from India all the way to Europe. It was huge. And he comes up with the idea that a massive golden statue is going to be placed in a very prominent place, and he instructs his musicians that when they play a certain song at his command, everyone hears the song, they're going to fall down and they're going to worship this giant golden statue. I know it's impossible to think that a despot could ever act like this, but this stuff is as old as the hills, right? And he calls together his satraps and his governors and all kinds of religious officials, and he gives them the word that there's this statue. You may have noticed it. It was enormous. It's made out of gold. When my band plays up its tune, you're going to fall down and worship. And that's precisely what they do. That is, except 3 young men. You remember their names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That'll do you well on Double Jeopardy some night. Just remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And by the way, those were their Babylonian names. Those were the names that were given to them by their captors. But these three young men, because they were so bright and showed so much promise, actually had a position of service in the king's administration. And there were some other court officials, Chaldeans, who saw that these three young men refused to fall down and worship the giant golden idol. And we don't know whether it was an image of the king or whether it was one of his favorite gods that was portrayed. We have no idea. But they won't bend the knee. And so they're ratted out by these other court officials who just maybe don't like them or don't think it's proper that they're not doing what the king said, for crying out loud. And King Nebuchadnezzar apparently had some sense of a generous spirit, at least initially. He thought maybe there's been a misunderstanding, so he invites the three young men, commands them actually into his presence, and he tells them, maybe you weren't clear on what I said, but when the band plays, you need to fall down and worship giant golden statue. And if you don't do that, I got this big fiery furnace, and that's where you're going. Are we clear on that? And the response of the three young men was really remarkable. They said, with all due respect, Your Majesty, we serve you. We are in your court. We'll do our very level-headed best. We acknowledge that you are the king of the mightiest empire on the face of the planet at the time, but we cannot fall down on our faces and worship a giant golden statue because our God won't allow that. See, they were devout Jews. They were unwilling to assimilate and to accommodate. And they remembered the first and the second commandment. And these are recorded for us in the book of Exodus. It is there that we read, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them. You shall not worship them. Is that clear? That's pretty clear, right? Now, I know when you and I hear this story, you see, we're intended to ask the question, what would I do? I mean, would I just kind of, cross my heart and bow down and, the fiery furnace, that's not a good thing. Maybe I just kind of go along with this. Would I stand like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did? That's always the kind of question that we're got tooling around in our heads as we hear these stories, as we read them. But these three decide that is clear as can be, and they're not going to be able to conform their behavior to the king's command. And it's at this point we pick up the story because Nebuchadnezzar kind of loses it. And he, if he was at 7 before, he turns it up to about 11 now. And you'll see as I read what happened next. Now then, Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. Have you ever been that mad? Maybe I have, I don't know. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames actually killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Yeah. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly, and he said to his counselors, was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire? And they answered the king, true, O king. And he replied, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god, some kind of divine figure. And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their tunics, they weren't even harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants and delivered them who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there will be no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now, due to the vivid imagery of this story, it shouldn't surprise us that it has been represented in various artistic forms, many of them over the last 2,000 years. A lot of artwork has been generated out of this story, and I think as we hear it, we can understand why. I ran across one 17th century art piece by Jacob Willems, which was actually a depiction of the fiery furnace, and he is part of, or was part of, the Dutch Master's School, so it's a very creative use of light. And I think it really illustrated for me so many of the wonderful themes that are presented in the story, because all of the light is on the three men who are in the fire. And their clothes are fine, their hands are raised up in worship, but their hands aren't bound anymore. That was the only thing consumed by the fire, was the things that they had been bound with when they were thrown in. And then right below that, you've got the men who threw them in, and they're not going to make it. Across is King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's kind of looking at the scene, puzzled, but there's light reflecting on his face from the fire. And there's also court officials that are around him, and they have a very concerned look on their faces because, maybe they were a little hasty in condemning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then, of course, there is Nebuchadnezzar pointing out the fourth figure there. And we don't know whether that was what kind of divine figure that is. The rabbinic tradition that was prominent about the time that the book of Daniel was actually written down held that it was the angel Gabriel. And of course, he's going to show up in our worship a little bit later this year once we get to Advent. But the main thing about the picture that I found really interesting is right dead center, you've got the statue, the golden statue, but you can barely see it. It's kind of receding into the background. It's there, it's prominent, it's huge, but it's not where the action is. All of the light indicates that's where God is, and it's in the fiery furnace, delivering these three young men from a terrible fate. And that really does get us to the central point of the story, and that is that under tremendous pressure to accommodate, to give in, to compromise our values from a spiritual or religious standpoint, even under threat of penalty or let alone even death, God calls us to be faithful. God calls us not to turn aside. And when we do that, God will protect us. And the amazing thing is that this story has been treasured and told and retold, and people have been inspired by it to take a stand in the face of challenges to compromise their faith for 2,000 years. And they've done that even though, in some cases, in many cases, it has actually cost them their lives. I mean, this is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say in their response to Nebuchadnezzar. They say, we don't know if God's going to save us or not. All we know is the commandments are clear. We can't worship this idol. And so whether God saves us or whether we die, it doesn't matter. We literally can't do what you're commanding us to do. So as I said, this story invites us to think about what we might do under similar circumstances. And because no one, to the best of my knowledge, has established a giant golden statue on the plains of Concord, we probably ought to think a little bit together about what actually idolatry is and why the scriptures are so insistent we should avoid it. Does it apply to us today? Well, fortunately, in our tradition, we are a confessional church. We have confessional documents that have been written over the course of the last 2,000 years, which help us understand and interpret the scriptures. And one of them, the Heidelberg Catechism, which was written during the Protestant Reformation, has a wonderful answer for us. And by the way, a catechism is read call and response. So I'll read the question, you got the answer, right? What is idolatry? Idolatry is having or inventing something in which one trusts in place of or alongside of the only true God who has revealed himself in the world. I bet you didn't know you had that in you. Right? A very workable definition of what idolatry is. You see, the people were being commanded by King Nebuchadnezzar not to fall down and worship a giant golden statue. In case you were wondering, the golden statue is not the point. It's what it symbolizes. What that statue symbolized was the power of empire, was the Babylonian Empire of which King Nebuchadnezzar was the head, with the power to overcome any foe or adversary. It had accumulated immense wealth by destroying people and taking for itself what they had. The empire was all about force, power, wealth. And what people were being asked to do was to acknowledge that in their worship as the ultimate and primary good in life. And that's what the first and the second commandments are really driven to prohibit in our lives. And that is that you and I would ever take something other than God and put it in that first position in our hearts and in our minds. Because human beings, and John Calvin was really clear about this, human beings are relentless idol generators. We are constantly putting in that place in our hearts that is reserved only for God, to seek God as the ultimate good in life. We're always trying to put other things in there: wealth, power, privilege, standing, sensual pleasure, you name it. It just goes on. We'll even put things in that place that aren't good for us and that will ultimately be destructive. And it doesn't work. In the 17th century, the French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote a little bit about this, and he described something like a God-shaped vacuum or cup that exists in the human heart. And it can only be filled by God. There's nothing else that can take that position of primacy in our lives that we can direct ourselves towards wholeheartedly, that is ultimately going to lead us toward a life that is good, that will leave us happy, and that will glorify God. And we're constantly trying to put other things in there. And as I said, it doesn't work well. Here's what Pascal had to say about it in some writing that was published after his death. What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace? This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. God alone is man's true good. And since man abandoned him, it is a strange fact that nothing in nature has been found to take his place. Stars, sky, earth, elements, plants, cabbages, leeks, animals, insects, calves, serpents, fever, plague, war, famine, vice, adultery, incest. Since losing his true good, man is capable of seeing it in anything, even his own destruction, although it is so contrary at once to God and to reason and to nature. See, this story still invites us 2,000 years later, more than that, to think about what has that position of first order or primacy in our lives. What is the absolute good that we are seeking above all else? And we're only capable of growing and developing as faithful people if we really decide we're not going to compromise that position by trying to put anything else in there other than God. Jesus understood this so powerfully. He was asked on one occasion to sum up the law. Do you remember that? You know, the people of his day were very concerned with the law, not only the 10 Commandments, but also the 613 commandments beyond that. And Jesus was asked as a teacher, as a rabbi, to sum up the law. And we still call it the great commandment. Remember what it is? You know, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Here's what we read in Matthew. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. See, oftentimes when you ask people what the great commandment is, they'll say, oh, we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus didn't say that. Well, he did, but it's incomplete. What Jesus said, and he's very much affirming the wisdom of the first and the second commandment here, it starts when we love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. When we set our hearts and our minds on God, and when we're seeking God, it is then out of that commitment, as we grow in that relationship with God, that we are given, that we develop, that we cultivate the capacity to love others, to love our neighbors and even our enemies as we love ourselves. The two belong to each other. It starts with loving God, seeking God beyond all other good. And then as we do that, it is growing in our capacity with God's help to be the people that God created us to be, to love others, our neighbors, as we love ourselves. So again, a powerful story, I think one that still speaks to us. It's an opportunity not for us to think about where there might be gigantic golden statues that we are worshiping, but to think beyond that and ponder a little bit this prohibition against idolatry, to ask, and this is the question we must always ask ourselves, does God have that first place in my heart and in my mind? Or is there something else? And if I've put something else in there, how can I turn today back towards God and get things where they should be? Amen.
We invite you to get to know our community better. You can do that by exploring our YouTube channel, and do hit subscribe and check notifications so we can send you any future updates. You can also explore our community of faith at the church website, lopc.org, and we hope you know there's always a place for you here.